You might not know this date, but I'm pretty sure you know what happened then. Here's a fairly famous picture of the Boston Tea Party, as it's usually called. A bunch of guys dressed up as Native Americans throwing tea into the ocean. So you kind of know about this, but there's a lot you don't know about this event. So it actually starts a bit before. The between the Boston Massacre event and the Tea Party are fairly quiet between Britain and the colonies. That debt, though, has not gone away 10 years later, and a bunch of new folks get elected to Parliament to try to fix that problem. There's Parliament. And they're looking for a way that won't be quite so noticeable for the colonists. And they think they've got an idea to solve that. And that is the Tea Act, passed in 1773. It raised a tax on tea, so anytime you buy tea, you're going to have to pay a tax. But this law actually lowered the price of tea. You'd be paying the tax, but your actual payment for the same amount of tea is actually going to be less. And there's some complicated reasons for that involving a company called the East India Trading Company, which we don't have to get into right now. The point is that this is going to make tea a lot cheaper for colonists to buy, which seems like a good thing. Tea was a very central part of life for all British people, especially English people, and in the country of England, and of course, and also in the colonies. So part of being English was having tea. And if it's cheaper, that seems good. This law was also designed to force some colonial merchants out of the tea trade, especially smuggling guys. Smugglers, people who sneak in things that are illegal, like getting tea from from other countries, like maybe even France, the evil enemy. Um, so again, it should be a good thing. These merchants shouldn't be smuggling tea. So this seemed like a way to raise a tax without making it cost more for people, and a way to just enforce the law that people should be following. What's the problem here, right? What's wrong with it? Well, the Sons of Liberty have some answers for that. For one thing, they complain this is a form of unfair government interference, getting involved with businesses. And I guess you could think of it this way: if today there was a law passed that said stores can only sell Microsoft products, then what's going to happen to Apple stores? Apple would have a pretty big problem with that. Um, well, that complaint didn't have anything to do with the smuggling. They leave that part of it out. So perhaps if Apple were doing something illegal, that law might make sense, strange as it sounds. The other thing that they complained about was that this is more taxation without representation. It's the same complaint that they've been making for about a decade now. And they're thinking, maybe we can protest this in a way we haven't tried before. So this is not a high level, it's really more of a mid-level event. The Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams on the left, John Hancock on the right, uh, are some of the main planners of this. This is not something happening at the lower level. The common people are not really involved, because actually tea prices being lower would have been good for them, but not so good for the merchants. So here's another picture again, that destruction of the tea in 1773, that event that the Sons of Liberty plan. Several pictures made many years later. Also, many years later, it's called a tea party. That was not the name given to it at the time. And none of these are accurate because it happened at night in the dark, so no one could have really seen, and there was no real audience. It's about $1 million worth of tea that they end up destroying from that one ship, and this did not belong to the British government. This belonged to a private company. So really, this was private property getting destroyed. So some of the wealthier men, like Franklin and Washington, others at the high level of society, are actually horrified by this. They don't think it's a good idea at all. But other folks in the Sons of Liberty do the same thing in other cities as well. They think it's a good idea, and they spread it up and down. Again, they're not calling it a tea party. The lower level of society is not involved in this really at all. The other audience, of course, was the folks in England, King George and Parliament, and they are very, very angry and upset about this. And now we've gone beyond just taxes. Now we're up to punishment time, especially from Massachusetts. This seems like Massachusetts' fault. Massachusetts. How do you say that? Massachusetts' fault. Yeah. So the coercive acts That's the name of the laws passed by Parliament. Coercive means forceful, means intimidating, gonna get you, uh, kind of laws. The colonists call them intolerable acts, or many colonists call them this. And the purpose of these is, we're not talking about taxes really anymore. This is punishment, really to get back at Massachusetts for the destruction of the tea, and at the same time increase the governor's power. Each colony had a governor uh, who had been chosen by the king, and it's meant to give that person more power, and it's sending a warning to other colonies not to do what Massachusetts did. So in a way, it's sort of the classic group punishment. So one of them affects Massachusetts town governments, basically makes the town governments in Massachusetts pretty much powerless, gives the royal governor power to approve any laws, anything they pass, any judges. It's really up to the governor now. And there have been a lot of democratic traditions, a lot of democracy in Massachusetts, more than in most other colonies. Town meetings, local power of each town, common people in each town really had a say. Here's a example of a town meeting in the present world, but similar kind of buildings and similar kind of turnout of people being able to make decisions. And one of these intolerable acts takes that away. This is one of those ways to punish Massachusetts and add power to the governor. And this is the governor that King George sends over. He's a military general. Most governors before had not been military men. His name's Thomas Gage, and he'll come into the story a few times when we look in 1775. So another one of these closes Boston Harbor to all trade. No more of that is going to be going on in Boston Harbor until the tea is paid for. Again, that was about $1 million worth or so. Um, that actually never ends up happening. The tea never does get paid for, and it's very unclear who would even pay for it. Um, so whether Parliament actually expected this to work or not, we can't really be sure. But this closes Boston Harbor. Anyone who had a job, which is pretty much everybody in Boston, was connected to trade in some way. So a lot of folks are out of jobs. A lot of lower level folks are out of jobs, even though they didn't protest in the first place. That's another thing of the group punishment. Third one, this affects not just Massachusetts, it strengthens that quartering act that we'd gone into previously, making sure that these soldiers are taken care of, and it protects these officers from any legal trial in the colonies. So nothing like the Boston Massacre trial would happen again. If any British officer is accused of something, it's going to get dealt with back in Britain, not in the colonies. It's another way of taking power away from the colonists and giving more power to the British military and British government. And here's the last one we'll get into. Free speech in the colonies gets limited. Uh, here's how you would be sending a message at that time, right? Quill pen, parchment paper. It allows officials to capture any messages that would be sent around. There was no official real postal service at this time. You would pay a messenger to send a message for you, and now officials can capture those. This was designed to prevent rebels from communicating with each other. But again, this is going to affect everybody in the colonies, not just the rebels, but everybody. Um, and it's limiting free speech that they had had for a very, very long time and that they expected to be able to do as British citizens. So, what is this Continental Congress? It's continental because there were men coming from almost all of the colonies, from all over the continent of North America. And a Congress is just a word for a meeting of representatives. This is the first one. There will be a second one the following year. And what they're doing is they're gathering to discuss a continental response, a group response to the Intolerable Acts. It's kind of like that Stamp Act Congress that had worked before, but there are even more men from even more colonies. And the Intolerable Acts are more to have to respond to. This is a picture of sort of what you can imagine they were meeting as, one colony per table. And these are the names of some of the people at that Congress. Some of them are familiar to you, some of them will become more familiar later on. So this Congress agrees by the end of their meeting that they will send supplies by land to Massachusetts. By water won't work because the Boston Harbor's been closed, but they'll send things along by land to help Massachusetts out, get things that they need. And they agree that in each colony they will start training a militia for possible war with England. These men are not in uniform. A militia is a group of men preparing to fight as soldiers, but they also have a regular job in their spare time. They're learning how to train and to fight as soldiers, just in case. So these are the two things that Congress finally agrees that they're going to go home and tell their people that they need to do. Now, you might have noticed earlier I said they finally agreed on those things, and that's because there's a lot of talking and arguing that goes on in this Continental Congress. It may not have taken 2 months if they'd done a lot less arguing. That picture down below kind of shows the sort of atmosphere in the First Continental Congress. So why would there be such problems at this place? Well, there are really about three reasons why. One is egos. Wait, that's not wrong picture. That's not egos. That's egos, like the waffles. No, egos. Yeah, like that, right. Ego. You have these guys in this Congress who are used to being kind of the top dog in their own colony, used to being listened to all the time, and think that they are everything there is to listen to. And they're in a room with a bunch of other folks who feel exactly the same way. So that leads to a lot of arguing. Another thing going on is some regional differences. You have, again, people from all over the continent up and down who've never talked to each other really even outside their own colony. And Massachusetts folks have different attitudes than folks from the Carolinas or even from Pennsylvania and New York. So they have to work out some of these cultural regional differences first. Then finally, there are different political attitudes. Actually, not everyone at this Congress had the idea that England was so evil. Yeah, are they actually friendly to us and they'll listen to us next time? There are some other ones who have very different political attitudes that no, England is out to get us and we need to take them on. So these are some of the real big three problems for the men of the Continental Congress. So to wrap things up here, it's the end of 1774. The members of that Congress get back home and spread the word of what they've decided. Nobody knows that war will start the next year. The rebels, American rebels, are preparing for the next conflict. Adams, Hancock, Sons of Liberty consider their next move. They expect the British will back down again, but they're gathering some weapons just in case. And that's how 1774 ends.